All right. So I guess I should start by saying we've got the section assignments worked out, and we're trying to figure out how to get it posted to Canvas. But in the meantime, I think today we'll send out an email to everyone with the listing of who's in which section. And we managed to get almost everybody in the section that they said that they could do, except for some of the people that couldn't make any of the sections because of like athletic commitment. But we did the best that we could, and we'll send it around. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today now is how we can use games. Oh, I'm going to close this door. So last class we talked a bunch about what cooperation is and how lots of examples of cooperation as an important element of life. And today what we're going to focus on is the games part, and so sort of the beginning of the intro to game theory, and how we can use games as a way to study cooperation and to understand important differences across a lot of the different kinds of cooperation that we talked about in the last class. Okay, so when we say what are games, and why do we need games, when one usually talks about evolution, the basic idea of evolution is mutations that lead to higher fitness spread through the population. And these are usually things, it could be mutations that make you stronger or faster, have better endurance, whatever. And these are things that are just across the board better. It's good to be stronger or faster, and therefore those genes have a fitness advantage and they spread. And in the context of economics and decision making, most of decision making is you say, well, you try and figure out which option is going to give you the highest payoff, and you pick it. And it's usually things like risk taking, what risk do you want to take, what thing do you want to buy, what do you want to eat, how much do you want to save for the future versus spending now, etc. And all of these examples are things where there's just each option has some value, and that value might depend on who you are and it might depend on the situation, but it doesn't depend on what other people are doing. These are what we call individual choice problems. And lots of stuff is our individual choice, but not cooperation. And when you get into the domain of social interactions, that is interactions with other organisms, other people, there's a fundamental difference, which is the payoff associated with any given action doesn't depend just on what you chose and what the scenario is. It also depends on what the other person does, or other people do. And what that means is that even for a same person in the same scenario, which strategy or which choice is optimal depends on, isn't constant, but it depends on what the other people are doing. And so, if we want to study these social interactions, which is, cooperation is inherently a social thing, we need some formalization for these payoffs where the payoff depends on the actions of others. And that is what game theory is. It's a language for describing these kinds of social interactions. And the way game theory works in its essence is you have some social situation and you want to try and model it. And so when you use game theory, you break it down in the following way. First, you say, what are the set of different players involved in this interaction? And then you say, the set of people, the set of actors, whatever. And then you say, for each player, what is their set of choices? And then for each possible combination of choices for each player, you say, this is the payoff that each of the players gets. And with these three things, you have a complete language, basically, for describing any kind of social interaction that you want. And it allows you to take, super complex things like, love, romantic relationships, professional relationships, whatever, all these different things, and it gives you a language for distilling it down into some kind of core essence that's captured by these simple games with a set of players, set of options, set of payoffs. And what we're going to try and do in this class is see the power of this approach. Obviously, in simplifying things, you lose something. That is, you're getting rid of some level of richness. But I'm going to try and argue that these simple game representations give you deep insights into things through virtue of their simplicity. And there's two different ways that you can use these games. One is theory, which is you can say, for a given game, so for a given social situation distilled down into game form, the theory lets you say what should happen, like normatively, what should we expect people to do in these situations. And then you can also use these games for as experimental paradigms. You have people actually play the games for money, and you look at what they actually do. You look at how that lines up with the theory and lines up with what you observe in the world. And then you can sort of iterate on the theory based on the data. And now, in terms of the theory part, which is what we're going to focus on, particularly for the first chunk of the class, there's two fundamentally different ways of thinking about the theoretical question of what strategies should occur, what should you expect to happen. In economics, this question is usually in the form of what should result from rational prospective reasoning. Like these people are having an interaction, playing some game, and each person is thinking to themselves, well, what would I expect the other person to do? And given what I expect the other person to do, what should maximize my payoff and let me choose accordingly? And then in evolution, the agents are not thinking, they're not doing any kind of planning or decision making. It's just each agent has a strategy that is, specifies what it does, and then natural selection operates on it, where the frequency of strategies changes as a result of reproduction, be it genetic reproduction or sort of imitation, cultural reproduction. And what we're going to see is that these two different ways of thinking about what strategies should occur arrive at the same answer, basically. And this is a lot of the power of game theory to me, is that sort of rational prospective reasoning, a whole different range of learning dynamics and genetic evolution all lead you to basically the same set of rules can be used to determine how all these different processes are going to turn out. And so now we're going to start talking about how we're going to put into practice the distilling of social situation into game and looking at some of the implications. So we're going to start. Yeah.
So when those charts aren't color-coded, is the item to the left of the comma always this side and the right is the top? Okay.
Yeah, so the standard setup in all of these things is that in each cell you have the row player's payoff, comma, the column player's payoff. And I'll try and color-code them at least in the beginning, but yes, that's the general structure of these. So I was going to say, so when we have one of these payoff matrices, you have in this game, we have two players, player 1 and player 2, so we've got our set of players. Each player has two actions available to them, cooperate or defect. And then for each combination of choices by each player, you have the payoff of player 1 and the payoff of player 2. And this, as we talked about last time, is one formulation of the prisoner's dilemma, where cooperation is paying the cost C to give the benefit B to the other person, and defection is doing nothing. And we said there's also this more general formulation where there's the temptation of exploiting the other person, the reward of mutual cooperation, the punishment of mutual defection, and then the sucker payoff of being exploited by the other person. And just this is a reminder that there's an annoying notational feature here, which is big C is the action cooperate, and little c is the cost of cooperating. And they're not only are they not equal to each other, they're fundamentally different things. Like this is describing a strategy, and this is an actual payoff cost. So sorry about that. I didn't look it up, but keep that in mind as we go through these slides. And as we talked about last time, in this game, defection always outperforms cooperation, no matter what. So, and in this prisoner's dilemma setup, because cooperation is always beaten by defection, you always wind up in a sort of bad, worse off. Both people are worse off. corner of mutual defection, and there are a lot of cooperation situations that have this kind of social dilemma flavor. But that is not necessarily the only thing that there is in cooperation. For example, a lot of the time, the benefit that you get from the other person cooperating depends on what you do. And in particular, a sort of extreme version of this is to say, so like if I cooperate with you, you only get a benefit if you also cooperate with me. So it's sort of like mutual effort is required to create the benefit that might be shared. And so then we can say, okay, well, how would this change the payoff structure? That would transform it into a payoff structure where still, if both people defect, no one gets anything, like in the prisoner's dilemma. If both people cooperate, they both pay the cost and they both get the benefit, like the prisoner's dilemma. But now, when one person cooperates and the other person defects, it used to be the cooperator paid the cost and the defector got the benefit. But now, in this situation where mutual effort is required to create any benefit, the person that cooperates still pays the cost, but no benefit gets created. And so the person that defects gets nothing. And this fundamentally changes the strategic nature of the situation, because now it's no longer the case that defection is always better than cooperation. If you think about it, if you say, okay, so imagine if the other person cooperated, if you defect, you get nothing because no benefit is created, whereas if you're willing to cooperate, you pay a cost, but the benefit gets created. And so now it's actually better to cooperate, that if it's payoff maximizing for you to cooperate, if you expect the other person to also cooperate. And so some examples of things from last class that we talked about that have this structure rather than a sort of pure social dilemma structure are, for example, in context of hunter-gatherers, well, really, I guess the hunting part more so than the gathering part. There's this game theory game called the Stag Hunt that captures this basic idea. The idea of the Stag Hunt game is you have two options. Either you can try and hunt the stag, which is like a big deer that has a lot of meat and it is a great thing, or you can hunt the hare, that is a rabbit, which is just like easier to catch but much less payoff. And the thing is, it's much more effort to catch a stag, and most importantly, you can't do it on your own. And so like if one person, so it's a two-player game, if both people decide to hunt the stag, they can go and they can hunt the stag, and that's a great outcome, they get to split it. If both people decide to hunt hare, then they each go out and they get a little hare, fine, that's not as good, but it's something. Whereas if they miscoordinate, then one person tries, gets all suited up for stag hunting, while the other person goes to hunt the hare. The guy that tries to hunt the stag really gets burned because they can't get the stag, but the person that goes for the hare, which is a sort of non-cooperative option, doesn't get any benefit out of the other person trying to cooperate. And so more broadly, in a lot of these situations, you need both people to work together in order to produce the good cooperative outcome. Another example is sorry, yeah?
No, just clarifying, is in game theory lingo, is there kind of an algebraic notation for like the maximizing strategy?
Yeah, so we're going to, the Nash equilibrium is the sort of core concept that we're going to deal with a lot over the class, and next class we'll sort of get into that in some detail. So the idea is this class will be like, here are a bunch of the games that have these different flavors, and the next class we'll talk about basically how do you decide what's an optimal strategy. Okay, so in a sort of more modern context, if you think about a lot of the organizational examples, and in particular, I think this is what happened when I did a Google image search for startup, although I'm not entirely sure. But so if you think about in the context of startup, where you can sort of, if you're a member of a small startup, you can be willing to put in the crazy hours, sleeping in the office, working infinite time to try and get this thing off the ground, or you can be like, I'm not willing to invest that much in, I've got other stuff I want to do, so that you can cooperate or you can defect. And if everybody cooperates, then you have a chance of this really great outcome of getting the startup off the ground and having major success. Whereas if some people are free riding and sort of not contributing, then the startup is going to fail, and those people aren't going to benefit from the hard work that the other people are producing, because it requires everybody really putting in maximal effort to potentially create this benefit. So again, it has this flavor where if you expect everybody else to be working hard, it's actually payoff maximizing for you to also work hard. Although the flip side is still also true, which is if you expect everybody else to be slacking, then there's no point in you working hard because it's not going to work anyways. Another version of this that my friend who's a professor in Amsterdam, Matthias van Balen, made up as an example of a game of this structure he called the Rock Band game. This is me circa 2000 probably, maybe 2002, something like that. Coordinating with my buddy to get the song sung. And the idea of the Rock Band game is you can either practice hard and put in the effort to get good at your instrument, or you can just hang out and go to the mall. And in order for the band to be good, everybody has to practice. And so if everybody practices, then you can have a good band. If even one person in the band is going to screw around, then the band is going to suck no matter what everybody else is doing. So it has this flavor. It's maybe not a great example for punk rock bands, because there, the idea is not really to put that much effort in, or at least not to be that proficient. But whatever. Okay, so what all of these examples have to do with each other is that unlike the social dilemma, where it's just affection dominates, these are situations that involve coordination. And so this is a class of games in the game theory lingo of coordination games. Coordination games are games where the payoff maximizing strategy is to do the same thing as the other person. And so in this example that we had before, which we took our prisoner's dilemma and we just changed this payoff from D to 0, such that when one guy cooperated and the other guy defected, the defector got nothing rather than getting the benefit. This game is a coordination game because if the other person cooperates, you do better to cooperate than to defect, whereas if the other person defects, you do better to defect than to cooperate. So rather than one action always being better than the other, you want to coordinate. And then we can have, in our more general RSTP specification of these games, you can also have a coordination game, and what's required for it to be a coordination game is that, like in the prisoner's dilemma, the sucker payoff of being exploited should be less than the punishment payoff of mutual cooperation. But unlike in the prisoner's dilemma, now the temptation to exploit the other person is actually smaller than the reward of mutual cooperation, because in trying to exploit them, benefit doesn't get created, and so it has this flavor. And this is what's required for a coordination game in general, and for this to be a cooperative coordination game, that is to say that C is cooperative, so C is CC is better than DD. We also want R to be greater than P, so that again the sort of mutual cooperation outcome is what's desirable. And again, the key idea here is that the optimal strategy is to do what the other person does. And this is, in the cooperation case, you can also have a much simpler version of a coordination game, which is just, this is the simplest possible coordination game, when just say there's option A and option B. If both people do the same thing, they get some positive payoff of 1, and whether it's A or B doesn't matter, and if they do different things, they get nothing. And so the point is just, so rather than the other ones where you have to match the other person, but better if you can both match on cooperation than if you both match on defection, here it doesn't matter. Just as long as you coordinate on something, it works out. And so one example of this kind of game is, which side of the road should you drive on? Doesn't matter, right? There's not anything intrinsically better about driving on the right side of the road versus the left side of the road. It just matters that everybody's on the same page and doing the same thing. And again, what's fundamentally different about this kind of coordination game versus the kind of cooperative coordination games that we're going to focus on is precisely the fact that it's not in any kind of sense better to coordinate over an equilibrium versus the other. Okay, now another type of coordination game or sort of coordination scenario that you can have is what's called asymmetric coordination. So far in all the games that we've talked about, the two players both had the same options, and the payoff matrix was symmetric in the sense that if I cooperate and you defect, if I cooperate and you defect, the payoffs are the same as if I defect and you cooperate, just switched between us. But it needn't be that way. So as I said, we define cooperative coordination by saying that the payoff of mutual cooperation is better than mutual defection, and in simple coordination, it doesn't matter, the payoffs are equal. But in the asymmetric case, it could be that it's better to coordinate, but the two different players have different payoffs depending on which of the two choices they coordinate on. And so the canonical example of this in the game theory language, which dates back probably to the 70s, in a time that was less conscious of many things, so forgive me for the title of this game, but it's called the Battle of the Sexes. And the idea of the Battle of the Sexes is that you have two players. So you have two players, and in the canonical Battle of the Sexes example, you've got a man and a woman, and they're trying to decide on where to go for a date. And their two options are either to go to the opera or to go to a football game. And they want to do something together. So if one goes to one option, if one person goes to the opera and the other person goes to the football game, they both get a bad payoff because they don't get to go on a date together. So it's better to coordinate than not coordinate. But let's say that when they go to the opera, the man gets a payoff of 5 and the woman only gets a payoff of 2 because she doesn't like opera and loves football. Whereas when you go to the football game, say the man gets a payoff of 2 and the woman gets a payoff of 5. Whereas if they split, then they go to different things, they both get 0. And so the idea here, again, is it's good to coordinate. Okay, so here are some other sample payoffs, say 3 and 2 rather than 5 and 2, whatever, doesn't matter. We have the same idea. So now we got player 1 and player 2 with these two options, and it's not symmetric in the sense that within this option, player 1 is getting 3 and player 2 is getting 2, and here player 2 is getting 2, player 2 is getting 3 and player 1 is getting 2. And so the point is they would rather wind up in either of these cells than in the miscoordinated ones, but player 1 would rather wind up here and player 2 would rather wind up here. And this is a model of a lot of interpersonal dynamics where people have different preferences but have a preference to do things together. It's also a good model of a lot of situations in the context of negotiation where there are different parties that need to reach some kind of agreement but have differing preferences over which kind of agreement get reached. And another cool example of this sort of thing is these. Whatever. It's another preference example that one of my students likes to give. So, Okay. So to summarize so far, we've got prisoner's dilemmas where in the prisoner's dilemma, both people face a social dilemma. That is, for both people, no matter what the other guy does, you do better to defect than to cooperate. And then we talked about these coordination games where it's optimal for both players to match, even if there are some cases where there's differing preferences over which thing to coordinate on, still both people want to coordinate. But you can also put these together such that for one player it's a social dilemma, so they just strictly prefer to defect, whereas for the other player it's a coordination game. It's payoff maximizing to cooperate if the other person cooperates, but not if the other person defects. And so you can see an example of this back in the startup, but now rather than the game being played by the different members of the startup, you can see this as, at least for certain types of not so great startups, a game between the startup and the investors. So for the investors, it's a coordination game in the sense that they're paying a cost to invest in the company. If the people in the company work hard and are successful, then the investors benefit from it. If the people in the company don't work hard, shirk, and the company fails, and they just take the investors' money and go to Hawaii, then that's bad for the investors, obviously. But the point is, if the people in the startup are cooperative, with respect to the investors benefit, and so it's self-interested for them to invest in companies that they think are going to work hard. Whereas you can imagine from the company side, if it's the case, that they say, they basically had a great pitch, but they didn't actually have any product, and so they managed to get the investors to invest in them. For them, if they know the company's not going to succeed anyways, for them it's strictly payoff maximizing to just shirk and go to Hawaii and not try and invest in it, because regardless of what they invest in it, it's going to fail. And so there are these sort of asymmetric incentives across the two parties. Another example of this comes from insurance, and I guess like insurance fraud, where if you think about it, it's like, so the insurance example is, so basically this is this idea from what in economics they call this moral hazard, where one party has an incentive to, one party investing, so I sell you insurance, it makes sense for me to sell you insurance if you are going to not, sort of commit fraud and not exploit me, because then, we've set the terms such that it's mutually beneficial. But in the absence of laws enforcing good behavior, once we have an insurance contract, you have an incentive to, cause the bad thing to happen, cause the fraud, and get the money. So again, there's this sort of asymmetric incentives across the two players, and this is also something that shows up a lot in the context of sort of romantic relationships, where there you can think about this in terms of fidelity and like partner choice. Depending on the sort of preferences of the different parties, you can have situations where for one party it's worth investing if the other person is going to be faithful, but not if not, and for the other party it's just not worth being faithful. And so you can have the same kind of moral hazard situation. And the way this is often modeled, or the sort of canonical game for modeling this, is called the trust game, sometimes also called the investment game. And the idea here is player one starts with some amount of money, let's say C, sort of C units of payoff, and decides whether to keep it or to transfer it to player two. If player one transfers it, then that amount is multiplied by some amount B, which is sort of, so benefit is created through the investment process, or through the sort of mutual investment, trust kind of process. And then player two decides whether to split that amount that she now has, the sort of C times B, or to keep it all. And so if you think about how this translates into payoff structure, here let's just, to put some specific numbers on it, let's say that the amount that player one starts with is 10 units, so C is 10, and say that B is say that B is 3. So player one starts with 10 units, decides whether to transfer it. If she transfers, it gets tripled, and then player two decides how much, whether to split it or not. And so if player one decides to just keep the 10 units, then player two doesn't get to do anything, and player one gets 10 and player two gets nothing. So that's okay for player one, and not great for player two, but whatever. Whereas if player one decides to transfer it, the 10 turns into 30 units, and then if player two decides to transfer back and split it, they each get 15. Whereas if player two decides to just keep it, player two gets 30 and player one gets nothing. And so if you think about this game from each person's perspective, from the perspective of player one says, well, if player two is going to is going to sort of be trustworthy and transfer back, then I'd rather transfer than keep the money, because this benefit's created and when I get my share of it, it's great. Whereas if player 2 is just going to keep the money, then I would rather keep it myself than transfer it, so I don't lose my 10 units. And so for player 1, it has this coordination flavor where they want to match player 2. Whereas from player 2's perspective, if player 1 keeps, well, it doesn't really matter what player 2 does. Whereas if player 1 transfers, player 2 strictly does better to keep. And so player 2 has no incentive to transfer back, which then would lead player 1 to keeping the money, even though player 1 would rather transfer if they thought that player 2 was going to be willing to transfer back. And so, this is a situation where even though it's a coordination game for one person, because it's a social dilemma for the other one, you wind up in the sort of bad, inefficient, like sort of not social or welfare maximizing outcome, because the person for whom it's coordination will expect the person for whom it's a social dilemma to not cooperate. And this is a sort of just a binary version where we say, I'm just saying you can either keep or transfer, but it could also be continuous where player 1 chooses how much to send to player 2 decides how much to send back. And again, the idea is that it's coordination for player 1, but a social dilemma for player 2. So that's one version of this sort of differing incentives across the two players. And the other most famous, the next one is probably the most famous of all of the game theory games, I guess, except for the Prisoner's Dilemma. But in terms of when you talk about experiments and in sort of context of psychology, I feel like the game that's most often talked about is the ultimatum game. And so the way the ultimatum game works is that there's some amount of potential money. It's a model of negotiation. And so you imagine that there's some amount of money on the table that player 1 and player 2 can potentially earn together. So there's some money to split. And player 1 gets to propose a division of that money. It says, I get a certain amount, and player 2, you get this other amount. And then player 2 can either accept that proposal, in which case they each get, the money as per the proposal, or player 2 can reject it, in which case neither of them get anything. And so, for example, say that there's 10 units, there's $10 to be divided, and say we just give player 1 two different options. Either make a fair split, which is they split it 50-50, or player 1 can propose an unfair split where she gets $8 and player 2 gets $2. And then player 2 can either say, yeah, I'm willing to accept whatever offer you make, or player 2 can say, no, I'm going to reject it if you make the unfair offer. And so if you think about then how this fills in the payoff table, if player 1 makes a fair offer, then they both get 5-5, and player 2 will accept it in either case. So regardless of which of player 2 strategy there is, they both get 5-5. Whereas if player 1 makes an unfair offer and player 2 is willing to accept it, then the payoff is 8-2. But if player 2 rejects the unfair offers, then player 2 will reject the unfair offer, and they'll both get 0. And so now, if you look at the payoff structure here, and again, I should say this can also be continuous the same way that the trust game could be continuous. That is, it could be player 1 chooses how much to offer, and player 2 chooses what's the minimum amount they're willing to accept, or whatever. And so now if you look at the payoff structure, it again has this flavor where if you think about for player 1, so if player 2 is going to accept anything, then it's better for player 2 to be unfair than fair. But if player 2 is going to reject unfair offers, it's better for player 1 to be fair than unfair. And so for player 1, it has this coordination flavor of, you want to sort of, if the other person is going to have this kind of, basically not demand fairness, then no reason for you to be fair. If the other person is going to demand fairness, then you need to be fair. But for player 2, there's no incentive to demand fairness, because if you think about it, so if player 1 is fair, it doesn't matter what player 2 does. But if player 1 makes an unfair offer, then player 2 does better, makes a higher payoff by accepting than by rejecting, because rejecting is just leaving money on the table. And so, again, player 1 can sort of assume that if player 2 is just trying to maximize their payoff, that they would be willing to accept everything, and therefore player 1 should make the unfair offer. And the reason this game is a favorite game among psychologists, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, is when you have people actually play this game, despite the fact that it's totally irrational for player 2 to accept the unfair offers, lots of player 2s get pissed when player 1s make unfair offers and reject. And then there's this question of why, and that's part of this evolution of cooperation question is how do we explain it when people do things that it seems like the analysis says they shouldn't. And as I said, we'll talk about some of the proximate psychological explanations in the next class. Okay, then an even simpler and also very widely talked about game, and I put game in quotes because it's technically not a game in the definition that I gave at the beginning of a game is something where each person's payoff depends on the other person's choice. The dictator game is like the ultimatum game, except player 2 doesn't get to make any choice. Player 2 has to just accept whatever player 1 gives. So the idea is player 1 is like a dictator that gets to unilaterally determine what happens. And so an example payoff is just like, well, player 2 has no choice, and player 1 just decides, do I do a 50-50 split or I do an 80-20 split? And so just to summarize this so far, again, we've got the prisoner's dilemma, where you should defect no matter what the other person does. And so in the game theory language, we say there, defection is the dominant option. You've got coordination games, where you should match what the other person does. So neither choice is dominant. It just depends on what the other person is doing. And then we've got these sort of mixed games, the chess game and the ultimatum game, where it's coordination for one player, whereas the other player has a clear dominant option. And this is most of the space of what's possible in these sort of two-player, two-option games. But there's one other class of situation, the canonical version of which is the snowdrift game, particularly, at least in the context of cooperation of games of these flavors. And snowdrift works as follows. So it's got a little story associated with it in the same way that the prisoner's dilemma has the story about the prisoners. And so the snowdrift story is, you imagine the two cars are driving home on a winter evening, and they're coming from opposite directions, and they find the road blocked by a snowdrift. And so now each person has a choice, which is, do you want to get out and shovel the snowdrift, which is like being cooperative, or do you want to stay in your car and keep warm, which is like not being cooperative? And the key here is also, okay, what should you do? And if the other person is going to get out and shovel the snowdrift, then great, you should stay in your car. So if the other person is going to cooperate, it's better for you to defect. And you stay warm and manage to get home. But if the other person is not going to shovel and is just going to stay in their car, then better for you to get out and shovel than to just sit in your car all night. And so here, it's in some sense the opposite of a coordination game. If we think about this in terms of the RSTP payoffs, now the idea is, so if the other guy is going to get out and shovel, so if the other person is going to cooperate, it's better for you to defect and stay in the car than to cooperate. So T is greater than R. But which is the same as in the prisoner's dilemma. But if the other guy is going to defect, then it's better for you to get out and shovel than it is for you to stay in the car. So now the sucker payoff of being exploited is actually still better than the punishment of mutual defection. So in the snowdrift thing, both people defecting is really bad because then they don't get home. You can also think of this in the benefit-cost framework. So here the idea would be, so if both people, you pay some cost to get out and shovel, you get a benefit B from getting home. If both people get out and shovel, they both go home, and the cost is actually split between the two of them. It only takes half as much effort to shovel because both people are shoveling. So you get B minus C over 2 for both players. If both people stay in their car, they don't get anything. And the other key difference now is that if I cooperate and the other guy defects, I'm paying the cost of shoveling, he's getting the benefit of getting home, like in the prisoner's dilemma, but now there's this extra feature where I also get the benefit of getting home. And these games, if we use the same logic that we have sort of been walking through in the other ones, and being like, okay, well, is there a dominant strategy here? Like, what should I do? What you see is that there's actually neither strategy is dominant, and it's rather than either always wanting to defect or wanting to match the person, here you want to do the opposite. You want to anti-coordinate. You want to, whatever the other person does, you want to not do. So if the other person cooperates, you want to defect. If the other person defects, you want to cooperate. And so what that means is that you'd always expect to see some amount of cooperation in games like this, because even if the other guy's definitely going to defect, still it's worth it for you to get out and shovel. And so this is actually the explanation that is given for example, the thing that I talked about yesterday with the yeast creating this invertase enzyme, where they pay some metabolic cost to create this enzyme that they then secrete into the environment to split these sugars into forms that then the yeast can eat. And so the question is, why don't all the yeast just free ride and let other yeast produce the enzyme and just eat the sugar themselves? And the answer is that it has this snowdrift flavor where if some other yeast is going to produce the enzyme, great, you'd much rather not produce the enzyme and just eat the sugar. But if nobody else is going to produce the enzyme, you'd much rather produce the enzyme than starve to death. And so the reason that you get a substantial amount of sort of cooperation and enzyme production here is because if no one else is going to do it, better for you to do it. It has this snowdrift flavor. And another example of things that are that have a lot of the snowdrift flavor are group projects. So if you think about a lot of situations where, it's specifically group projects that aren't that hard, such that one person on there, if only one person is working hard, you can get the project done. So you would rather the other person does the work than you do the work. But if you know the other person isn't going to do the work, then better for you to do the work so you both don't fail than to just neither person do anything and both fail. And another thing that is a anti-coordination game, and this one now is rather than 2 players, it's between the whole country. But I think democracy also has this flavor where you don't need everyone to vote. And if you knew that every single person was going to vote, it wouldn't really matter if you said, well, screw it, I'm not going to vote. But you need some critical mass of people to vote in order for the system to work. And so it's one of these things where the optimal amount of cooperation is some kind of intermediate. And other examples of anti-coordination games, and this is so Snowdrift is the canonical version that I like, but there's 2 other canonical versions, one from economics, I think, and one from evolutionary biology. And so one is Chicken. That is, the fun car racing game that I'm sure you all play in your free time, where 2 people line cars up at each other and accelerate towards each other at maximum speed, and the first person to swerve is the loser, the chicken. And so the idea here is that it's an anti-coordination in that if you know the other person isn't going to swerve, if you know the other person is going to swerve, then you don't want to swerve because you get to win. But if you know the other person is not going to swerve, then you definitely want to swerve. And so that's why the classic strategy for winning Chicken, should you ever find yourselves playing Chicken, is to, in a way that is observable to the other person, commit yourself to not being able to swerve by, for example, throwing the steering wheel out the window. And so that works in anti-coordination games because if you know the other person definitely is going to do, well, okay, then I better swerve. And the other version from evolutionary biology is Hawk-Dove, which is a sort of model of aggressive versus passive approaches to, say, confrontation or whatever. And so the idea is that if both people, so there's some resource and you can fight over it in an aggressive way, or you can sort of be passive and be like, well, okay, fine, whatever. And so if one person chooses to be aggressive and the other person chooses to be passive, the aggressive person or organism or whatever just steals the good and gets it, which is a good payoff. But if both people choose to be aggressive, then there's a fight that ensues that is very costly. And so it's a thing where you only want to be aggressive if you think the other person is going to be passive. Otherwise, bad things happen. And so, to sort of summarize these three different types of games, we've got the social dilemma games, coordination games, and anti-coordination games. One way to think about it is that in the social dilemma, the sort of benefits of cooperation are just created by each individual. So if I cooperate, you get a benefit, it doesn't matter what you do. And so there's no incentive to be cooperating because you just hope the other person cooperates and what you do doesn't matter. And so, and whereas in coordination games, you imagine that the benefits of cooperation are sort of difficult to produce. And so they require concerted effort. They require both people cooperating in order for the benefit to be produced. Or another way of saying it is the benefit that it comes from you cooperating is substantially increased if the other person also cooperates. And this creates this incentive to cooperate if you expect the other one to cooperate. And then there's also in the opposite, in the anti-coordination case, you imagine that the benefits of cooperation are very easy to produce. So they only require, a subset of the people in a two-player game, so they only require one of the two people cooperating in order to create the benefit, like in the snowdrift case. And so a way of thinking about that is that means that the benefits from you cooperating are substantially lower if the other person also cooperates. And that leads to a desire to anti-coordinate rather than a desire to coordinate. And so the sort of take-home of all of this is that we've talked about a bunch of different kinds of cooperation. We've looked at how they could be sort of split into these three different categories. And what that shows us is, though, at the beginning, I had a very brief picture which said self-interest should always favor defection over cooperation. But we saw in a lot of these games, in a lot of these cases, there is actually a self-interested motive to cooperate. For example, in coordination games, if you expect the other person to cooperate, then it's self-interested for you to cooperate. And in anti-coordination games, if you expect the other person not to cooperate, then it's self-interested for you to cooperate. And so those are classes of situations where you get cooperation. Maybe not the optimal amount of cooperation, but you at least get some cooperation through pure self-interest. But there are also a lot of situations where self-interest isn't enough. For example, anything that's a social dilemma, like a prisoner's dilemma type setup, you're not going to get cooperation through self-interest. And then also, even in coordination games and anti-coordination games, if people's expectations about what the other person are going to do are wrong or are, in particular sets of expectations, are going to lead people to defect, even though it's a situation where there could be some self-interested benefit. So what we're going to do next lecture is we're going to talk about this Nash equilibrium concept. That is, how do you calculate in some formal sense what is the optimal self-interested strategy. And then we're going to also talk about sort of behavioral economics, basically, or one branch of behavioral economics, of how you incorporate other kinds of motivations like fairness and altruism into preferences. So have a good weekend.